When Staff Sergeant Marcus Tank Rodriguez felt his uniform patch tear during what should have been a routine combat drill, he had no idea that the quiet presence of communications specialist Sid Thompson behind him would unlock a truth that had been buried for 15 years, a truth that would shatter everything he thought he knew about courage, brotherhood, and the day his father never came home from Afghanistan. The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Campbell's training grounds as Staff Sergeant Marcus Tank Rodriguez adjusted his tactical vest one final time. At 28, he had earned his nickname through sheer determination rather than size, though his broad shoulders and steady presence certainly helped. Today's combat drill would test the new communications protocol that had taken months to develop, and as squad leader, Marcus knew every eye would be on his team's performance. Behind him, communications specialist Sid Thompson quietly checked his equipment for the third time. Sid had joined their unit 6 months ago, transferring from a base in Colorado with commendations that spoke louder than his soft-spoken nature. Where other soldiers filled silence with jokes or complaints, Sid listened. Where others rushed into action, he calculated. Marcus had noticed these qualities, but had never given them much thought until today. The drill scenario was designed to simulate a reconnaissance mission gone wrong. Marcus's 8-man team would navigate through a mock village, establish communication with base command, and extract a high-value target while under simulated enemy fire. It was the kind of exercise they had run dozens of times, but the new communication system added variables that made everyone nervous. Rodriguez, your team is green light in 5 minutes, called Master Sergeant Patricia Hayes from the command post. Her voice carried across the training area with the authority of someone who had seen real combat in 3 different theaters. Remember, this isn't just about completing the mission. We're testing how well you adapt when technology fails you. Marcus nodded and turned to address his team. Besides Sid, there was Corporal James Fisher, whose ability to find cover in impossible places had saved them in countless training scenarios. Private Sarah Martinez brought demolitions expertise that could open any door or create any distraction. Specialist Tony Kowalski served as their medic, though his steady hands were equally valuable with a rifle. Private First Class Kevin Park handled additional communications backup, while Corporals David Diesel Washington and Mike Wrench rounded out their firepower and technical skills. "Listen up," Marcus began, his voice carrying the confidence that had made him a natural leader since basic training. Today's about more than following protocol. When communications break down, and they will, we fall back on what we know best. Trust each other, watch each other's backs, and remember that every decision we make affects the whole team. The words felt familiar in his mouth, echoes of lessons his father had taught him long before he ever considered military service. Sergeant First Class Roberto Rodriguez had been a communications specialist himself, serving 2 tours in Afghanistan before his convoy hit an IED 15 years ago. Marcus had been 13 then, old enough to understand the folded flag, but too young to grasp the full weight of loss. His father's final letter had arrived 3 days after the notification. In it, Roberto had written about the importance of the soldiers who worked quietly behind the scenes, the communications specialists, the intelligence analysts, the logistics coordinators who kept everyone else alive through preparation and precision rather than firepower. The loudest heroes aren't always the ones who save the most lives, the letter had said. Sometimes the quiet ones do more than anyone realizes. As the team moved toward the starting position, Marcus caught sight of Sid adjusting his radio pack. There was something methodical about the way Sid worked, a precision that reminded Marcus of his father's old photographs, always showing Roberto hunched over communication equipment, focused and serious even in candid moments. The mock village stretched before them, a collection of plywood buildings and shipping containers arranged to simulate a Middle Eastern settlement. Smoke machines created an eerie haze while speakers hidden throughout the area would soon erupt with the sounds of simulated gunfire and explosions. It looked nothing like the real villages Marcus had seen during his deployment to Syria, but It captured the essential challenge: navigating unknown territory while maintaining communication and protecting each other. Team Alpha, your weapons hot, came the voice through their headsets. Your mission begins now. Marcus led them through the entrance of the village, using hand signals to direct his team into a standard formation. Fish took point, his small frame allowing him to move between buildings like a shadow. Martinez and Greek flanked left while Park and Diesel covered the right approach. Wrench stayed close to Marcus, ready to handle any technical challenges they might encounter. Sid maintained position directly behind Marcus, close enough to relay communications, but far enough back to avoid interfering with combat movements. As they progressed through the first section of the village, everything went according to plan. The communication system worked flawlessly, relaying their position back to command and coordinating with other teams operating in adjacent areas. Then, the simulation began in earnest. Speakers erupted with the sounds of automatic weapons fire. Smoke grenades deployed throughout the village, reducing visibility to mere feet in some areas. Marcus felt his pulse quicken as muscle memory took over, his training transforming simulated chaos into manageable problems that required specific solutions. Contact front, Fish's voice crackled through the radio. Multiple targets, second floor of the blue building. Marcus directed Martinez and Greek to provide covering fire while he and Diesel moved to flank the position. The movements felt natural, each team member anticipating the other's actions through months of training together. As they advanced, Marcus could hear Sid's steady voice maintaining communication with base command, providing precise updates on their location and status. The team's coordination was flawless until they reached the village center. That was when the communication system began to fail, exactly as Master Sergeant Hayes had predicted. Static filled their headsets, making coordination nearly impossible. Without clear communication, the team had to rely on visual signals and instinct. Marcus pressed against a concrete barrier, gesturing for his team to take cover as simulated enemy fire erupted from multiple directions. The sound was deafening, forcing him to rely on hand signals to coordinate their next move. He turned to relay instructions to Sid when he felt it, a sharp tearing sensation across his left shoulder blade. His uniform patch had caught on a piece of rebar protruding from the concrete barrier. As he twisted to free himself, the patch tore completely away from his uniform, fluttering to the ground like a damaged flag. For a moment, the simulation seemed to pause around him as he stared at the torn fabric. The patch wasn't just any insignia. It was his father's unit patch, the same one Roberto Rodriguez had worn during his final deployment. Marcus had sewn it onto his uniform the day he made staff sergeant, a private tribute to the man who had inspired his military service. Seeing it torn and dirty on the ground felt like watching his father's memory suffer fresh damage. That was when Sid appeared beside him. Without saying a word, the communications specialist had left his covered position and moved to Marcus's location. In the middle of simulated combat, with smoke and noise all around them, Sid knelt down and carefully retrieved the torn patch. As he stood up, his eyes met Marcus's, and something passed between them, a moment of understanding that transcended the chaos of the training exercise. Sid's expression was serious, almost reverent, as he examined the patch in his hands. The 35th Signal Battalion insignia was faded, but still recognizable, its distinctive lightning bolt partially obscured by years of wear. When Sid looked up again, Marcus saw something unexpected in the younger soldier's eyes, not just respect but recognition. "Your father served with the 35th, Sid said, his voice barely audible over the simulated gunfire. It wasn't a question. Marcus nodded, surprised by the observation. He had never mentioned his father's unit to anyone in the squad. Most of his teammates knew he had lost a parent in Afghanistan, but the specific details had always felt too personal to share in casual conversation. Sid carefully folded the torn patch and placed it in one of his utility pouches. "We'll fix this after the exercise," he said with quiet conviction. "It deserves to be treated right." There was something in Sid's tone that suggested deeper meaning. But before Marcus could ask questions, the simulation demanded their attention. The communication system flickered back to life just long enough for them to receive new orders. They needed to extract their high-value target from a building at the far end of the village within the next 15 minutes. As they resumed the exercise, Marcus found himself acutely aware of Sid's presence. The communications specialist moved with practiced efficiency, but there was something different about his demeanor now. Where before he had been professional and competent, now he seemed personally invested in their success. The extraction went flawlessly. Despite the communication failures and the challenging terrain, Marcus's team completed their mission with time to spare. As they gathered at the debriefing point, Master Sergeant Hayes congratulated them on adapting well to unexpected difficulties. "Rodriguez, your team maintained cohesion even when technology failed," she said, making notes on her clipboard. "That's exactly what we wanted to see today. Good work." As the other team members began cleaning their equipment and discussing the exercise, Marcus noticed Sid standing apart from the group. The communications specialist was examining something in his hands. The torn patch, Marcus realized. There was something almost ceremonial about the way Sid held it, as if it represented more than just a piece of fabric. Marcus approached him slowly, uncertain how to begin the conversation that clearly needed to happen. The afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the training ground and giving everything a golden quality that made the moment feel significant. "You recognized the patch immediately," Marcus said, making it a statement rather than a question. Sid nodded, still looking down at the torn insignia. "My father served with the 35th Signal Battalion," he said quietly. "Deployed to Afghanistan in 2009. He used to tell me stories about the soldiers he worked with, especially one staff sergeant who always made sure the communication specialists were protected during missions." Marcus felt his chest tighten. His father had deployed to Afghanistan in 2009, the same year he was killed. The 35th Signal Battalion was a large unit, but the dates and details were creating an uncomfortable pattern of coincidences. "What was your father's name?" Marcus asked, though part of him already suspected the answer would change everything. Sid looked up, meeting Marcus's eyes with an expression that mixed nervousness and certainty. "Technical Sergeant William Thompson," he said, "but everyone called him Billy. He was in the convoy with your father the day they were killed." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He had heard the name William Billy Thompson countless times over the years, in after-action reports, in condolence letters, and in his own research into his father's final mission. Billy Thompson had been Roberto Rodriguez's closest friend during deployment, the two men working together to maintain communications for their entire forward operating base. According to the official reports, both men had died instantly when their convoy hit an improvised explosive device while returning from a routine mission to install communication equipment at an outpost. Marcus had always imagined his father's final moments, but he had never considered that somewhere else, another 13-year-old boy had been imagining his father's final moments too. "Billy Thompson was your father," Marcus repeated, trying to process the revelation. "You're Sid Thompson. My real name is William Thompson, Jr., Sid explained. "But everyone's called me Sid since I was little. When I enlisted, I decided to honor my father by following the same career path. Communications specialist, same as him. I never expected to end up serving with Roberto Rodriguez's son." Marcus stared at the torn patch in Sid's hands, understanding now why the moment had felt so significant. This wasn't just a random equipment failure during a training exercise. This was the universe creating an opportunity for two sons to connect over the shared memory of their fallen fathers. They were best friends, Marcus said, remembering details from the letters and reports he had studied obsessively as a teenager. "Your father saved my dad's life twice during their deployment." Sid smiled for the first time since Marcus had known him. "My dad used to say your father was the best sergeant he ever served under. Said Roberto never asked anyone to take risks he wouldn't take himself, and he always made sure the support personnel felt like valued members of the team instead of just equipment." As the rest of the squad finished their post-exercise procedures, Marcus and Sid stood together in a bubble of shared understanding. The torn patch had become a bridge between past and present, connecting two families whose histories have been intertwined by tragedy and now by service. The training exercise was officially over, but Marcus knew that something much more important was just beginning. For 15 years, he had carried the weight of his father's legacy alone, trying to live up to a memory built from photographs, letters, and secondhand stories. Now, suddenly, he had found someone who shared that burden, someone whose father had known Roberto Rodriguez not as a legend or a memory, but as a friend and fellow soldier. As they walked back toward the barracks, Sid carefully handed the torn patch back to Marcus. "I meant what I said earlier," he said. "We'll get this fixed properly. My grandmother used to do alterations before she retired. She's repaired military uniforms before. She'll know how to treat it with the respect it deserves." Marcus accepted the patch, feeling its weight differently now. It was no longer just his father's legacy. It was a connection to a friendship that had transcended death, linking two families across 15 years of separation and grief. The sun was setting completely now, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded Marcus of the sunrise on the morning his father had left for his final deployment. That morning had been about endings and farewells. This evening felt like the beginning of something new, not just a friendship between two soldiers, but the continuation of a bond that bullets and explosives had been unable to break. As they reached the barracks, Marcus realized that the combat drill had accomplished something far more important than testing communication protocols. It had revealed a truth that had been waiting 15 years to be discovered, that sometimes the most important connections are forged not through shared victories, but through shared loss and the courage to honor those who came before. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new training exercises, and new opportunities to serve together. But tonight, for the first time since his father's death, Marcus Rodriguez felt like he wasn't carrying the weight of legacy alone. Sid Thompson understood that weight because he carried it too, and together they could honor their father's memory in ways that neither could have managed alone. The torn patch in Marcus's hand no longer felt like a symbol of damage. Instead, it felt like proof that some bonds are too strong to be broken by time, distance, or death. His father and Billy Thompson had been brothers in arms. Now their sons had the chance to continue that brotherhood, building on a foundation of shared sacrifice and mutual respect that had been 15 years in the making. 3 days after the combat drill, Marcus Rodriguez found himself standing outside a small house in Clarksville, Tennessee, holding a carefully wrapped package that contained his father's repaired unit patch. Sid had been true to his word about his grandmother's alteration skills, but the visit had become about something much larger than fixing torn fabric. Mrs. Eleanor Thompson answered the door with the kind of warm smile that immediately reminded Marcus why Sid possessed such steady confidence. At 72, she moved with the purposeful grace of someone who had spent decades taking care of other people, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, and her hands showing the careful calluses of a lifetime spent working with needle and thread. "You must be Marcus," she said, stepping aside to welcome him into a living room that felt like a museum of military history. "William told me you'd be coming by. Please sit down. I've been looking forward to meeting Roberto's son for 15 years. The casual way she mentioned his father's name caught Marcus off guard. He had expected politeness and perhaps some shared memories, but Eleanor Thompson spoke as if Roberto Rodriguez had been a regular presence in her life rather than a name from old military records. "Sid mentioned that you knew my father," Marcus said, settling into a comfortable armchair that faced a wall covered with military photographs. "I wasn't sure how much contact families had with each other during deployment." Eleanor smiled and disappeared into the kitchen, returning moments later with a thick photo album and 2 cups of coffee that smelled like it had been brewing since dawn. "Oh, honey, your father and my Billy wrote letters home constantly, and they mention each other in every single one." After a while, I felt like I knew Roberto almost as well as I knew my own son. She opened the album to a page that made Marcus's breath catch. There, in a photograph he had never seen before, his father stood next to a younger man who shared Sid's serious eyes and careful posture. Both soldiers were grinning at the camera, their arms draped over each other's shoulders in the easy camaraderie of close friends. This was taken about 2 months before they died, Eleanor said gently. Billy sent it home with a letter explaining that Roberto had just received news that his son Marcus had made honor roll at school. Your father was so proud of you, sweetheart. He talked about you constantly. Marcus studied the photograph, trying to reconcile the relaxed, happy man in the picture with the serious, duty-focused father he remembered. Roberto Rodriguez's letters home had always been formal and careful, focusing on general descriptions of daily life rather than personal feelings or friendships. Seeing him laugh and celebrating felt like discovering a hidden dimension of his father's personality. Billy wrote that your father used to stay up late writing letters to you. Eleanor continued, turning pages to reveal more photographs and documents. He said Roberto would spend hours making sure every word was right because he wanted to be the best father he could be, even from thousands of miles away. The observation stung because Marcus remembered those letters differently. To his 13-year-old mind, they had seemed distant and impersonal, dutiful communications from a father too busy with military responsibilities to share real emotions. Now, understanding the care that had gone into each carefully chosen word, Marcus felt ashamed of his younger self's impatience. I was angry with him for a long time, Marcus admitted. After he died, I felt like he had chosen the military over his family. Like serving his country was more important than being my father. Eleanor reached across the coffee table and placed a weathered hand on Marcus's arm. Oh, sweetheart, your father wrestled with that choice every single day. Billy wrote about it constantly, how Roberto would call himself selfish for missing your baseball games and school events, but how he also believed that serving overseas was the best way to make sure you grew up in a safe world. She turned to a page that contained a letter written in Billy Thompson's careful handwriting. Even from a distance, Marcus could see his own name mentioned several times throughout the text. Billy wrote this letter 3 weeks before they died. Eleanor said, "Would you like me to read the part about your father?" Marcus nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Eleanor adjusted her reading glasses and began to read in a voice that carried 15 years of grief and love. Roberto got another letter from Marcus today, and I swear the man's chest puffed out so much I thought his uniform might burst. His boy made varsity baseball team, and Roberto spent the whole evening telling everyone who would listen about Marcus's batting average and his plans for college. He carries those letters in his left chest pocket, right over his heart, and he reads them every night before lights out. I keep telling him that Marcus is lucky to have a father who loves him that much, even from far away. Roberto always says he just hopes Marcus understands someday that everything he's doing here is for his son's future. The words hit Marcus like a revelation. All those years of feeling abandoned and resentful, his father had been carrying Marcus's letters next to his heart and bragging about his achievements to anyone who would listen. The distance that had felt like neglect was actually Roberto's way of ensuring his son could grow up free from the fears that military families carry daily. I never knew, Marcus said quietly. He never told me how proud he was in his letters. He always seemed so formal. Eleanor smiled sadly. Billy used to tease Roberto about that. Your father would write these beautiful, heartfelt drafts full of emotion and love, then rewrite them 3 times to make them sound more appropriate. He was terrified of saying something that might worry you or make military life seem too dangerous. He thought being strong and steady in his letters was the best way to protect you. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the front porch. Sid entered the house carrying a bag of groceries, stopping short when he saw Marcus sitting with his grandmother. "I didn't expect you to be here yet," Sid said, though his tone suggested pleasant surprise rather than inconvenience. "Grandma, please tell me you haven't been showing him every embarrassing photograph I've ever taken." Just the military ones, Eleanor replied with mock innocence. Though I did mention the time you tried to enlist under a fake name when you were 16 because you wanted to deploy to the same base where your father had served. Marcus looked at Sid with new understanding. You tried to enlist early? Sid set the groceries on a side table and settled into the chair next to his grandmother. I was convinced that if I could get to Afghanistan, I could somehow learn more about what happened to my dad. Stupid teenage logic, but the grief was still pretty fresh. It wasn't stupid, Marcus said firmly. I applied to West Point specifically because I wanted to follow my father's path. I thought becoming an officer would help me understand why he had chosen military service over staying home with his family. Eleanor looked between the two young men with the satisfaction of someone watching a plan come together. You boys are more alike than you realize. Billy and Roberto would be so proud to see you serving together. She reached into the photo album and pulled out a sealed envelope that looked like it had been handled carefully for many years. Speaking of which, there's something I've been saving for the right moment. Billy wrote this letter specifically for Roberto's son, but he asked me not to send it unless I ever met you in person. He wanted to make sure his words were delivered properly. Marcus stared at the envelope, which bore his name in the same careful handwriting he had seen in Billy Thompson's other letters. The idea that a stranger had written him a personal letter 15 years ago, then entrusted his grandmother to deliver it at the right moment, felt surreal. He wrote this for me? Marcus asked, accepting the envelope with trembling hands. 3 days before the convoy mission, Eleanor confirmed. He said Roberto had been worried about how you would handle military life if you decided to follow in his footsteps. Billy wanted to leave you something that might help. Marcus opened the envelope carefully, conscious that Sid and Eleanor were watching him with expressions of anticipation and nervousness. The letter was written on standard military stationery, but the handwriting was warm and personal rather than official. Dear Marcus, the letter began. If you're reading this, it means something has happened to your father and me, and you've grown up to be the kind of young man who would seek out the families of his father's fellow soldiers. Your dad always said you had that kind of character, the type who looks for connections instead of running from difficult truths. I want you to know that your father was the best man I ever served with. Not because he was fearless or perfect, but because he cared more about his soldiers than he cared about looking tough. Every decision he made started with one question: how do I keep my people safe and get them home to their families? He applied that same thinking to you, Marcus. Every day he spent away from home was a day spent trying to build a world where you could grow up safe and free. Roberto worried constantly that you would think he chose the military over being your father. Nothing could be further from the truth. He chose to serve because he was your father, and he couldn't bear the thought of you growing up in a world where threats could reach American soil. He used to say that every convoy he ran, every communication system he installed, and every mission he completed was a letter written to your future, a promise that he was doing everything in his power to ensure you would inherit a safer world than the one he was born into. If you decide to follow in your father's footsteps and join the military, remember that courage isn't about being unafraid. Courage is about being terrified and doing the right thing anyway. Your father was scared every day we served together, scared of making the wrong decision, scared of failing his soldiers, scared of never seeing you again. But he never let fear stop him from doing his job or being the man his country and his family needed him to be. The most important thing I can tell you is this: your father's love for you was the strongest force I ever witnessed in 15 years of military service. It drove every decision he made and every sacrifice he accepted. You were never competing with the military for his attention. You were the reason he served. Take care of yourself, son. Your father believed you would grow up to be an amazing man, and I have faith that he was right. If my boy William ever crosses paths with you, I hope you'll remember that friendship can transcend anything, even death. With respect and admiration for the son of my dearest friend, Technical Sergeant William Billy Thompson, Marcus finished reading the letter in silence, aware that tears were streaming down his face but unable to care about maintaining composure. 15 years of anger, resentment, and misunderstanding were dissolving as he processed Billy Thompson's words. His father hadn't abandoned him for military duty. Roberto Rodriguez had embraced military duty because he was Marcus's father. He knew. Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. Your father somehow knew we would meet someday. Sid leaned forward, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. My dad always believed in connections. He used to say that good people find each other eventually, no matter how much time passes or how far apart life takes them. Eleanor stood up and walked to a display case that Marcus had noticed earlier but hadn't examined closely. Inside were two folded American flags, Billy Thompson's Purple Heart, and a collection of letters tied with a faded ribbon. Your father and my Billy made each other better soldiers and better men, she said, returning with a small wooden box. They promised to look after each other's families if anything happened, but they also promised something else. They each left instructions for their children to receive these if they ever met. She opened the box to reveal two identical military challenge coins, both bearing the 35th Signal Battalion insignia, but personalized with engraved names. One coin read, "For Marcus Rodriguez," from his father's brother Billy Thompson. The other read, "For William Thompson, Jr., from his father's brother Roberto Rodriguez." Marcus accepted his coin with shaking hands, understanding that he was holding more than just a piece of metal. This was proof that his father had planned for this moment, had hoped that someday the children left behind would find comfort and connection with each other. Sid received his own coin with similar reverence, turning it over in his palm as if memorizing every detail. They really were brothers, he said quietly. Not just soldiers serving together, but actual brothers. Which makes you two brothers as well, Eleanor said with satisfaction. Not by blood, but by something just as strong. Your fathers would expect you to look after each other the same way they looked after each other. The three of them sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, each processing the weight of what had been revealed. Marcus felt like he was seeing his entire life from a new perspective, understanding for the first time that his father's service hadn't been about choosing duty over family, but about extending family to include everyone Roberto Rodriguez was responsible for protecting. The patch, Marcus said suddenly, remembering why he had originally come to visit. Where's my father's patch? Eleanor smiled and retrieved the wrapped package from a side table. When Marcus unwrapped it, he found that she had done far more than simply repair the tear. The patch had been carefully mounted on a piece of dark blue fabric, surrounded by gold thread that created an elegant border. Beneath the 35th Signal Battalion insignia, she had embroidered two names in script so fine it looked like calligraphy. SFC Roberto Rodriguez and TSGD William Thompson, Brothers in Arms, 2009. I took the liberty of adding some personal touches, Eleanor said modestly. I hope you don't mind. It seemed like the patch deserved to reflect the full story of what it represents. Marcus stared at the beautiful memorial, understanding that Eleanor Thompson had created something that honored not just his father's service, but the friendship that had defined Roberto Rodriguez's final months of life. This wasn't just a unit patch anymore. It was a testament to brotherhood, sacrifice, and the connections that survive even death. It's perfect, Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. It's absolutely perfect. As the afternoon sun began to set through Eleanor Thompson's living room windows, Marcus realized that the torn patch during the combat drill had led to something far more valuable than he could have imagined. He had come seeking a simple repair and found instead a second family, a deeper understanding of his father's choices, and a friendship with Sid that felt both new and ancient. The challenge coins in their pockets and the memorial patch in Marcus's hands were more than just objects. They were bridges between past and present, connecting two fathers' love with two sons need to understand their legacy. Tomorrow they would return to military life, but they would return as brothers carrying forward a bond that had been 15 years in the making. The combat drill had torn a patch, but it had also revealed a truth that was stronger than fabric, deeper than memory, and more enduring than grief. That love and friendship can transcend any obstacle, including death itself. 2 weeks after discovering their father's connection, Marcus and Sid found themselves preparing for their first joint deployment. The 35th Signal Battalion was being sent to Iraq as part of a larger communications infrastructure upgrade, and both men had volunteered for the mission despite having the seniority to remain stateside. For Marcus, the deployment represented a chance to understand his father's choices on a deeper level. For Sid, it was an opportunity to honor his father's memory by serving in the same capacity that Billy Thompson had served 15 years earlier. The pre-deployment briefings took place in a sterile conference room at Fort Campbell, where Colonel Sarah Mitchell outlined their mission parameters with the clinical precision that characterized all military operations. The 35th Signal Battalion would be responsible for establishing secure communication networks across 3 forward operating bases, working closely with combat engineers and intelligence units to ensure reliable contact between deployed forces and command headquarters. This isn't a combat deployment in the traditional sense, Colonel Mitchell explained to the assembled soldiers. But you'll be operating in a contested environment where communication failures can result in casualties. Every piece of equipment you install and every protocol you establish could mean the difference between life and death for our people in the field. Marcus listened to the briefing with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness that he hadn't experienced since his first deployment to Syria 3 years earlier. This time, however, his anxiety wasn't about personal safety or mission success. It was about living up to the legacy that Roberto Rodriguez and Billy Thompson had established during their own deployment to Afghanistan. After the official briefing concluded, Marcus and Sid remained behind to review technical specifications for the communication equipment they would be installing. The technology had advanced significantly since their father's era, but the fundamental challenges remained the same: establishing reliable contact across vast distances while protecting sensitive information from enemy interception. My father's letters mentioned that he and Dad spent most of their time troubleshooting equipment failures rather than installing new systems, Sid observed, studying a schematic for digital radio networks. The technology was less reliable back then, but the environment was just as challenging. Marcus nodded, remembering passages from his father's letters that had described the frustration of working with communication systems that failed at critical moments. Roberto Rodriguez had written about the importance of having backup plans for backup plans, emphasizing that communication specialists could never afford to assume their equipment would work as designed. Colonel Mitchell made it sound routine, but I suspect we'll encounter the same problems they did, Marcus said. Different technology, same environmental stresses, same potential for equipment failure when you need it most. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Master Sergeant Patricia Hayes, who had requested a private meeting with both men after learning about their family connection. Hayes had served multiple deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan, giving her a perspective on military operations that extended beyond training exercises and protocol manuals. Rodriguez, Thompson, I wanted to discuss your deployment assignment, Hayes began, settling into a chair across from them with the confident posture of someone accustomed to difficult conversations. Word has gotten around about your father's service together. Some people think that makes you a good team. Others think it makes you a liability. Marcus felt his defensive instincts activate immediately. Ma'am, our personal connection won't interfere with mission effectiveness. If anything, it enhances our ability to work together under pressure. Hayes raised a hand to forestall further argument. I'm not questioning your competence, Rodriguez, but I need to know that you understand the weight of what you're carrying. Your fathers died together serving their country. That creates expectations and pressures that other soldiers don't face. The observation struck Marcus as both obvious and profound. He had spent the past 2 weeks focusing on the positive aspects of discovering Sid's family connection. The shared understanding, the deeper appreciation for his father's service, the sense of completing a story that had been left unfinished. But Hayes was right that their situation also carried unique burdens. What kind of expectations? Sid asked quietly. Hayes leaned back in her chair, choosing her words carefully. Some people will expect you to be heroes because your fathers were heroes. They'll assume you possess the same courage and competence that Roberto Rodriguez and Billy Thompson demonstrated during their final mission. Others will watch for signs that you're trying too hard to live up to impossible standards, waiting for you to make mistakes that prove you're not the man your fathers were. Marcus had never articulated these concerns, but he recognized their validity immediately. Since learning about his father's friendship with Billy Thompson, he had felt an increased pressure to justify Roberto Rodriguez's sacrifice through exemplary service. The challenge coin in his pocket had become both an inspiration and a burden, a reminder that he was carrying forward not just his own reputation, but his father's legacy as well. How do we handle that kind of pressure? Marcus asked. Hay smiled for the first time since entering the room. By being the soldiers you already are rather than trying to become the soldiers you think your fathers were. Roberto Rodriguez and Billy Thompson weren't heroes because they were perfect. They were heroes because they did their jobs with integrity and looked after their people. If you focus on those fundamentals, everything else will take care of itself. The advice sounded simple, but Marcus understood that implementing it would require constant conscious effort. Military culture encouraged soldiers to honor fallen comrades by emulating their virtues, but it could also create unrealistic expectations that led to poor decision-making and unnecessary risks. There's something else, Hayes continued, pulling a folder from a briefcase. I've been reviewing the after-action reports from your father's final mission. There are some details that weren't included in the official family notifications, but which might be relevant to your deployment. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. Official reports had always described his father's death in general terms, an IED explosion during a convoy mission that resulted in immediate casualties. The idea that important details had been withheld from family members created a mixture of anticipation and dread. Hayes opened the folder to reveal several documents marked with classification stamps that had been blacked out, indicating they had been declassified for specific purposes. Your fathers weren't just installing routine communication equipment during their final mission. They were establishing a secure communication link that would enable real-time intelligence sharing between multiple bases across their area of operations. She spread out maps and technical diagrams that showed the scope of Roberto Rodriguez and Billy Thompson's work. Rather than simple point-to-point communication, they had been creating a complex network that could coordinate activities across an entire region while maintaining security protocols that prevented enemy interception. The mission was successful, Hayes continued. The communication network they installed remained operational throughout the rest of the deployment and contributed to several successful operations against insurgent forces. Their work saved lives, prevented attacks, and provided tactical advantages that lasted long after they were gone. Marcus studied the documents, trying to reconcile this new information with his understanding of his father's final weeks. Roberto Rodriguez's letters had mentioned routine maintenance and equipment installation, but nothing about complex network architecture or strategic communications planning. Why wasn't this information included in the family notifications? Sid asked, voicing the question that Marcus had been afraid to ask. Hayes closed the folder carefully, because the families didn't need to know operational details that were classified at the time. The important information was that Roberto Rodriguez and Billy Thompson died while serving their country with distinction. But now that you're both deploying to similar work, I thought you should understand the full scope of what your fathers accomplished. The revelation reframed everything Marcus thought he knew about his father's final deployment. Roberto Rodriguez hadn't just been a communications specialist doing routine maintenance. He had been an integral part of strategic operations that required advanced technical skills and careful coordination with intelligence units. Our current mission involves similar work, Marcus realized. We're not just installing communication equipment. We're creating networks that will support ongoing operations across multiple bases. Hayes nodded. That's exactly right. And that's why I wanted to have this conversation. Your father's experience is directly relevant to what you'll be doing in Iraq. Not just their technical skills, but their approach to complex problem-solving under pressure. As the meeting concluded, Marcus and Sid walked back to their barracks in contemplative silence. The documents Hayes had shown them painted a picture of Roberto Rodriguez and Billy Thompson as highly skilled professionals whose work had strategic implications rather than simple technical soldiers following routine orders. "I never imagined my father was involved in anything that complex," Marcus said as they reached their quarters. His letters made everything sound so mundane. Sid stopped walking and turned to face his friend. "Maybe that was intentional. My father's letters were the same way. Lots of details about daily life and routine maintenance, but nothing about the importance of what they were actually doing. They probably wanted to protect their families from worrying about mission complexity on top of basic safety concerns." The observation made sense, but it also highlighted how much Marcus still didn't understand about his father's military service. Roberto Rodriguez had spent his entire career protecting his son from unnecessary anxiety, but that protection had also prevented Marcus from fully appreciating the significance of his father's work. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Corporal James "Fish" Fisher, who approached with the kind of purposeful stride that indicated important news. "Rodriguez, Thompson, Colonel Mitchell want to see both of you in her office," Fish reported. "Something about a change to your deployment assignment." Marcus and Sid exchanged glances, wondering if their meeting with Master Sergeant Hayes had triggered some kind of administrative review. Changes to deployment assignments usually meant either promotion to more critical responsibilities or removal due to concerns about readiness or suitability. Colonel Mitchell's office was larger than the conference room where they had received their initial briefing, but it carried the same atmosphere of focused professionalism. The walls were covered with maps of current deployment areas, communications diagrams, and photographs of successful missions from previous deployments. "Rodriguez, Thompson, please have a seat," Colonel Mitchell began without preamble. "I've received a request from Theater Command for 2 experienced communications specialists to join a special operations unit that's conducting sensitive missions in Western Iraq. The assignment requires soldiers who can work independently, adapt to changing circumstances, and maintain operational security under challenging conditions." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. Special operations assignments were typically reserved for soldiers with extensive deployment experience and proven track records under combat conditions. The fact that he and Sid were being considered suggested that someone at higher levels had reviewed their service records and found them suitable for more demanding responsibilities. "Ma'am, neither of us has specific special operations experience," Sid pointed out respectfully. Colonel Mitchell smiled slightly. "That's true, but you both have something more valuable: the ability to work together effectively under pressure." The Special Operations Commander specifically requested a 2-man communications team with demonstrated compatibility and shared commitment to mission success. She opened a file that contained their service records along with several additional documents that Marcus didn't recognize. "Your performance during recent training exercises has been exceptional, and your background gives you a unique perspective on the importance of reliable communications during complex operations." Marcus realized that their family connection wasn't being viewed as a potential liability, but as evidence of their ability to maintain trust and communication under stressful conditions. Someone had decided that the bond between Roberto Rodriguez's son and Billy Thompson's son represented an asset rather than a complication. "What would our responsibilities include?" Marcus asked. Colonel Mitchell spread out a map of Western Iraq that showed several marked locations connected by communication routes. "You would be responsible for establishing and maintaining secure communication links between special operations forces and their command structure. The work would involve some of the same challenges your fathers faced in Afghanistan, operating in contested territory while ensuring reliable contact between deployed forces and headquarters." The assignment represented everything Marcus had hoped for when he decided to follow his father's career path. It was complex, important work that would directly support soldiers in dangerous situations while requiring the kind of technical expertise and problem-solving skills that Roberto Rodriguez had demonstrated during his own deployment. "When will we deploy?" Sid asked. "2 weeks," Colonel Mitchell replied. "You would join the Special Operations Unit at their forward operating base and begin work immediately. The assignment is scheduled for 6 months, with possible extension depending on mission requirements and your performance." Marcus looked at Sid, seeing his own mixture of excitement and nervousness reflected in his friend's expression. This deployment would be more challenging than anything either of them had experienced, but it would also be an opportunity to honor their father's legacy through work that directly paralleled Roberto Rodriguez and Billy Thompson's final mission. "We accept the assignment," Marcus said, speaking for both of them with the confidence that came from knowing Sid would reach the same conclusion. "Colonel Michel nodded approvingly. I thought you would. Your fathers would be proud to see you taking on this kind of responsibility. Master Sergeant Hayes will coordinate your additional training and equipment requirements." Dismissed. As they left Colonel Mitchell's office, Marcus felt the weight of the challenge coin in his pocket, along with a sense of anticipation that had been building since the moment Sid had picked up his torn patch during the combat drill. They were about to embark on a mission that would test everything they had learned about military service, technical expertise, and working together under pressure. More importantly, they were about to follow in their father's footsteps in the most direct way possible, by taking on the same type of mission that had defined Roberto Rodriguez and Billy Thompson's final weeks of service. The deployment to Iraq would be dangerous and demanding, but it would also be a chance to continue the story that had begun with two friends serving together in Afghanistan 15 years earlier. The circle was closing, but rather than ending the story, it was opening a new chapter written by the sons who had inherited not just their father's legacy, but their commitment to service, brotherhood, and protecting the soldiers who depended on reliable communications to stay alive. The forward operating base Delta in western Iraq felt like the edge of civilization, a collection of reinforced structures and communication towers surrounded by endless miles of desert that stretched toward the Syrian border. Marcus and Sid arrived on a transport helicopter that kicked up clouds of dust so thick they couldn't see the landing zone until the aircraft was practically on the ground. The heat hit them like a physical force as they stepped off the helicopter, carrying their equipment bags, and the weight of expectations that had been building throughout their 2 weeks of intensive preparation. Captain Daniel Ghost Morrison met them at the landing zone with the kind of casual confidence that characterized special operations personnel. At 35, he moved with the economy of motion that came from years of missions where wasted energy could mean the difference between success and failure. His weathered face suggested extensive field experience, but his eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who understood that special operations success depended as much on planning and preparation as on physical courage. "Rodriguez, Thompson, welcome to the sandbox," Morrison said, leading them toward the operations center. "I hope you're ready for some interesting work. We've got communication challenges that would make your instructors back at Fort Campbell lose sleep." The base was smaller than Marcus had expected, but more sophisticated in its technology integration. Communication arrays pointed in multiple directions, creating a web of connectivity that linked the forward operating base with headquarters units hundreds of miles away. Solar panels and generators provided redundant power systems, while camouflage bunkers housed equipment that could maintain operations even under direct attack. "Your fathers established a similar setup in Afghanistan," Morrison continued as they walked past the main communication tower. "Different technology, but the same fundamental approach. Create multiple redundant pathways so that losing one system doesn't compromise the entire network." Marcus was startled to learn that Morrison knew about Roberto Rodriguez and Billy Thompson's service record. Special operations commanders typically focused on current capabilities rather than historical precedents, but Morrison spoke about their father's work with the familiarity of someone who had studied their methods. "Sir, did you know our fathers personally?" Sid asked. Morrison stopped walking and turned to face both men with an expression that mixed respect and something deeper, perhaps regret or sadness. I was a lieutenant in Afghanistan when your fathers were killed. My unit relied on the communication network they had installed, and their work saved my soldiers' lives multiple times during the weeks following their death. The revelation created an unexpected personal connection that went beyond professional evaluation. Morrison wasn't just their commanding officer for this deployment. He was someone whose own military service had been directly affected by Roberto Rodriguez and Billy Thompson's final mission. The communication network they established remained operational throughout the entire deployment. Morrison continued. Even after we lost them, their planning and redundant systems kept our people connected when traditional communications failed. I've been following both of your careers since you enlisted, waiting to see if you inherited your father's skills. Marcus felt the familiar pressure of living up to Roberto Rodriguez's legacy, but this time it was tempered by understanding that his father's work had concrete, measurable impact on real soldiers in dangerous situations. Morrison wasn't comparing them to abstract heroes. He was evaluating them against technical standards that had proven effective under combat conditions. The Operations Center was a climate-controlled environment filled with sophisticated equipment that represented 15 years of technological advancement since their father's deployment. Multiple screens displayed real-time information from across the region, while communication specialists monitored radio traffic and data transmissions that connected Special Operations Forces with their command structure. Your primary responsibility will be maintaining communication with 3 different Special Operations teams that are conducting surveillance and reconnaissance missions along the Syrian border, Morrison explained, pointing to a large tactical map that showed their area of operations. These teams operate independently for weeks at a time, relying entirely on secure communications for coordination, intelligence sharing, and emergency support. The map showed the same kind of complex network topology that Marcus had seen in the declassified documents about his father's final mission. Rather than simple point-to-point communication, they would be managing a sophisticated system that could reroute information through multiple pathways, depending on equipment status, weather conditions, and security requirements. The challenge is that we're operating at the extreme range of our communication equipment while maintaining security protocols that prevent enemy interception, Morrison continued. Your fathers faced similar problems in Afghanistan, but the technology available to potential adversaries has also advanced significantly. Staff Sergeant Lisa Wire Chun, the senior communications specialist at the base, joined their briefing with technical specifications that outlined the scope of their responsibilities. Chun had been deployed to Iraq 3 times previously, giving her extensive experience with the environmental and operational challenges they would face. The biggest problem is sandstorms, Chun explained, spreading out weather reports and equipment maintenance logs. We can lose communication with our forward teams for hours or sometimes days when the weather gets bad. Your job will be developing backup systems that can maintain contact even when primary equipment is compromised. Marcus studied the maintenance logs, recognizing patterns that reminded him of problems his father had described in letters from Afghanistan. Environmental conditions in Iraq were different from Afghanistan, but the fundamental challenges remain consistent. Maintaining sophisticated electronic equipment in harsh conditions while ensuring reliable operation when lives depended on successful communication. How often do we lose contact completely? Sid asked, examining frequency charts that showed communication success rates over the previous 6 months. Chin pointed to several entries that highlighted extended communication blackouts. More often than we'd like. Last month, one of our forward teams was out of contact for 36 hours during a sandstorm. They completed their mission successfully, but we had no way to provide support or coordinate with other units if they had encountered problems. The scenario illustrated exactly why Roberto Rodriguez and Billy Thompson's work had been so critical during their deployment to Afghanistan. Special Operations Forces could operate independently for limited periods, but extended missions required reliable communication for coordination, intelligence updates, and emergency support. Morrison led them to their quarters, which consisted of 2 adjacent rooms in a prefabricated building that housed communication specialists and intelligence personnel. The accommodations were basic, but comfortable, designed for soldiers who spent most of their time working rather than relaxing. You'll have 48 hours to familiarize yourselves with our equipment and procedures before taking over primary responsibility for forward team communications, Morrison said. Chen will handle your orientation, but I want to emphasize that this isn't training. From day 3, you'll be responsible for maintaining contact with soldiers whose lives depend on your technical competence. After Morrison left, Marcus and Sid began unpacking their equipment while discussing the scope of their responsibilities. The assignment was more complex than anything either of them had handled previously, but it was also exactly the kind of challenge that would test everything they had learned about communications technology and working together under pressure. This is what our fathers were doing, Marcus said, examining the sophisticated radio equipment that filled their workspace. Different technology, but the same fundamental mission, keeping Special Operations Forces connected with their support structure. Sid nodded, running diagnostic tests on the encryption systems they would be using to secure communications with forward teams. My father's letters mentioned that the hardest part wasn't making the technology work. It was anticipating all the ways it could fail and having backup plans ready before problems developed. Their conversation was interrupted by Staff Sergeant Chun, who returned with detailed technical manuals and training schedules that would occupy their next 2 days. Chen's approach to orientation was thorough and systematic, covering not just normal operating procedures, but also emergency protocols for equipment failure, weather disruption, and potential security compromises. The most important thing to remember is that you're not just operating communication equipment, Chen explained as she walked them through the primary control station. You're maintaining lifelines for soldiers who are operating hundreds of miles from any support. When they call for help, you need to be ready to connect them with whatever resources they need. Marcus appreciated Chen's emphasis on the human dimension of their technical responsibilities. Communication specialists could easily become focused on frequency management and signal strength while losing sight of the fact that their work directly affected real soldiers in dangerous situations. The first night at Forward Operating Base Delta, Marcus found himself unable to sleep despite exhaustion from travel and orientation. He stood outside their quarters, looking up at stars that seemed impossibly bright in the desert sky, while thinking about the responsibilities he and Sid would assume in less than 48 hours. Sid joined him after a few minutes, carrying 2 cups of coffee that suggested he was also having difficulty transitioning from anticipation to rest. Nervous? Sid asked, settling beside Marcus on a concrete barrier that provided seating while offering a clear view of the communication towers. Marcus considered the question carefully. He felt nervous, but it was the productive kind of anxiety that came from understanding the importance of upcoming challenges rather than fear of personal inadequacy. More excited than nervous, Marcus replied. This is exactly what I hoped military service would involve. Work that matters with someone I trust, using skills our fathers developed during their own service. Sid smiled, pulling the challenge coin Roberto Rodriguez had left for him from his pocket. Even in the darkness, the metal caught enough starlight to be visible as he turned it over in his palm. I keep thinking about what your father wrote in his letter, Sid said, about courage being the willingness to do the right thing even when you're scared. I'm definitely scared about the responsibility we're taking on, but I'm also confident we can handle it. Marcus pulled out his own challenge coin, feeling the weight of 15 years of anticipation and preparation. Tomorrow, they would begin work that directly paralleled their father's final mission, but they would bring their own skills, their own approach to problem solving, and their own commitment to the soldiers who would depend on their technical competence. We're not trying to replace our fathers, Marcus said, voicing a realization that had been developing throughout their preparation for deployment. We're continuing their work with our own skills and our own understanding of what the mission requires. The distinction felt important because it released them from the impossible burden of trying to replicate Roberto Rodriguez and Billy Thompson's specific achievements while maintaining the obligation to uphold the same standards of professionalism and dedication. As they sat in the desert darkness, Marcus and Sid reviewed their technical preparations and discussed contingency plans for the various problems they might encounter. The conversation was practical and focused, covering frequency management, backup power systems, and maintenance schedules that would ensure reliable operation of their communication networks. But underlying the technical discussion was a deeper conversation about legacy, responsibility, and the ways that sons could honor their father's memory without being constrained by the weight of impossible expectations. They were about to begin the most challenging assignment of their military careers, but they were beginning it as partners who understood both the importance of their work and their capability to succeed. The next morning brought their first full day of hands-on training with the Special Operations Communication Systems. Staff Sergeant Shun proved to be an excellent instructor, combining technical expertise with practical wisdom gained from multiple deployments in similar conditions. She pushed Marcus and Sid through increasingly complex scenarios that tested their ability to maintain communications under various failure conditions. Your father's approach to redundancy planning was brilliant for their technology, Chen observed as they worked through a simulation involving multiple equipment failures. But current systems offer capabilities they couldn't have imagined. The challenge is integrating those new capabilities with the fundamental principles that made their network so reliable. By the end of their second day of training, Marcus and Sid had demonstrated proficiency with all primary and backup systems while developing additional contingency plans that impressed both Chun and Captain Morrison. They were ready to assume full responsibility for forward team communications, but more importantly, they had gained confidence in their ability to handle whatever challenges the deployment might present. The evening before taking over primary communication responsibilities, Morrison invited them to join him for dinner in the command staff dining area. The meal was simple military fare, but the conversation provided insights into special operations that neither Marcus nor Sid had experienced during their conventional military service. Special operations depend more on preparation and planning than on dramatic action. Morrison explained between bites of reconstituted beef stew. Your fathers understood that principle perfectly. They never took unnecessary risks, but they were always ready when situations required immediate action. He paused, studying both young men with the calculating gaze of someone evaluating their readiness for serious responsibility. Tomorrow you'll begin maintaining communication with soldiers whose lives depend on your competence. Morrison continued. That's exactly the same responsibility your fathers carried during their deployment to Afghanistan. The technology has changed, but the fundamental requirement remains identical. Keep good people connected so they could do their jobs and come home safely. Marcus felt ready for that responsibility in ways he hadn't fully understood when they first arrived at Forward Operating Base Delta. The training, preparation, and gradual immersion in the mission had built confidence while revealing the scope and importance of their upcoming work. More significantly, he felt connected to his father's legacy in ways that went beyond simple emulation or tribute. Roberto Rodriguez and Billy Thompson had established standards for communication specialists serving with Special Operations Forces. Now, their sons had the opportunity to meet those standards using their own skills, their own approach to problem solving, and their own commitment to the soldiers who would depend on their technical expertise. The Desert Star seemed even brighter that night as Marcus and Sid made final preparations for the most important work of their military careers. Tomorrow, they would assume responsibilities that directly paralleled their father's final mission, but they would do so as experienced professionals rather than young soldiers trying to prove themselves worthy of inherited legacies. The torn patch that had started everything now resided in Marcus's footlocker, carefully preserved in the frame that Eleanor Thompson had created. But the real memorial to Roberto Rodriguez and Billy Thompson would be built through the reliable communication networks that their sons would maintain, keeping Special Operations Forces connected and safe during missions that depended on technical excellence and unwavering dedication. 4 months into their deployment, Marcus and Sid had established themselves as the most reliable communication team Forward Operating Base Delta had seen in years. Their success wasn't measured in dramatic rescues or heroic actions, but in the steady competence that kept Special Operations Forces connected across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. Every morning brought new challenges, equipment failures, weather disruptions, and evolving security threats, but their partnership had proven capable of maintaining communication even under the most difficult circumstances. The test came on a Tuesday morning when the largest sandstorm in 2 years swept across their area of operations, creating conditions that would challenge every backup system they had developed. Satellite communications failed within hours as atmospheric particles disrupted signal transmission. Ground-based radio networks struggled against interference that made normal frequency coordination impossible. By noon, Forward Operating Base Delta had lost contact with all 3 forward Special Operations teams, leaving Marcus and Sid responsible for re-establishing communication with soldiers who were operating deep in contested territory without any support network. Captain Morrison found them in the communication center at 1,400 hours, working frantically to restore contact through alternative frequency combinations and improvised signal boosting techniques that pushed their equipment beyond normal operational parameters. "How long since last contact?" Morrison asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer would be problematic. 3 hours and 17 minutes with Alpha Team, Marcus reported without looking up from his frequency analysis. 4 hours and 43 minutes with Bravo Team. Charlie Team hasn't responded in over 5 hours. The numbers represented more than technical statistics. Each team consisted of 8 highly trained Special Operations soldiers who were conducting surveillance missions along routes used by insurgent forces moving between Syria and Iraq. Without communication, those teams had no way to coordinate with each other, request support, or report intelligence that could prevent attacks against larger coalition forces. Weather reports suggest the storm will continue for another 12 to 18 hours, Morrison said, studying meteorological data on one of the auxiliary screens. "We need communication restored before then, or we'll have to consider extracting all teams blind." Extracting the forward teams without communication would require helicopter missions into contested territory without current intelligence about enemy positions or team status. The risk to extraction crews would be enormous, but leaving Special Operations Forces without communication during extended operations was equally unacceptable. Marcus and Sid had been preparing for exactly this scenario since their second week at Forward Operating Base Delta. They had identified several alternative communication methods that might work during extreme weather conditions, but implementing those methods would require technical modifications to existing equipment and coordination procedures that had never been tested under actual operational conditions. "We have a plan," Sid said, pulling up technical diagrams that showed proposed modifications to their primary antenna array. "But it requires bypassing several safety protocols and operating our transmitters at power levels that could damage equipment permanently." Morrison studied the diagrams with the focused attention of someone who understood that technical solutions in special operations often required accepting risks that would be unacceptable under normal circumstances. "Explain the approach," Morrison said. Marcus took over the briefing, outlining a plan that combined multiple low-frequency transmission techniques with signal amplification methods that could penetrate atmospheric interference created by the sandstorm. The approach required coordinating 3 different antenna arrays, manually adjusting transmission power in real time, and using frequency combinations that violated standard communication protocols. "The technique is based on approaches our fathers developed in Afghanistan," Marcus explained, showing historical references that documented similar solutions during extreme weather events. They discovered that certain frequency combinations could maintain contact during conditions that disrupted conventional communication methods. Morrison reviewed the historical documentation with interest. Roberto Rodriguez and Billy Thompson's innovation in developing alternative communication techniques during challenging environmental conditions have been noted in their service records, but the specific technical details had never been widely disseminated. "Will this work?" Morrison asked directly. Sid looked at Marcus, sharing a moment of silent communication that represented 4 months of partnership under pressure. They had discussed this exact scenario multiple times, planning technical solutions and building confidence in their ability to implement unconventional approaches when conventional methods failed. "Yes, sir," Marcus replied with the confidence that came from thorough preparation and absolute trust in his partner's technical competence. "We can re-establish communication within 2 hours." Morrison nodded decisively. "Do it. I'll coordinate with headquarters to explain why we're violating communication protocols. You focus on getting our people back online." What followed was the most intense 2 hours of Marcus and Sid's military careers. Working in perfect coordination, they modified antenna configurations, bypassed safety systems, and implemented frequency management techniques that required constant manual adjustment as atmospheric conditions changed throughout the afternoon. Marcus handled primary transmitter operations, while Sid managed signal analysis and frequency coordination. Their communication was efficient and instinctive, each man anticipating the other's needs and adjustments without requiring explicit discussion. The partnership that had begun with a torn patch during a training exercise had evolved into technical collaboration that maximized both their individual skills and their collective capability. At 1,547 hours, they achieved partial contact with Charlie Team, scratchy, intermittent communication that confirmed the team's position and status, but couldn't support extended conversation. Marcus felt his chest tighten with relief as the team leader's voice came through the static, reporting that all personnel were safe and continuing their mission despite communication difficulties. Bravo Team came online 23 minutes later, their signal clearer due to slightly better atmospheric conditions in their area of operations. Alpha Team required another 45 minutes of technical adjustments before Marcus and Sid could establish reliable contact, but by 1700 hours, all three forward teams were back in communication with their command structure. The relief in Captain Morrison's voice was evident as he coordinated with headquarters to report successful restoration of forward team communication. The crisis that had threatened to force dangerous extraction missions had been resolved through technical innovation and partnership that exceeded every expectation. "Outstanding work," Morrison told Marcus and Sid as they began shutting down their improvised communication configuration. "You maintained contact with our forward teams under conditions that would have defeated most communication specialists." Marcus felt a deep sense of satisfaction that went beyond professional accomplishment. He and Sid had successfully handled the kind of crisis that tested everything they had learned about military service, technical expertise, and working together under extreme pressure. More importantly, they had solved the problem using approaches that directly built upon techniques their fathers had developed 15 years earlier during their own deployment. As the sandstorm began to weaken that evening, Marcus and Sid found themselves once again standing outside their quarters, looking up at stars that were gradually becoming visible through clearing atmospheric conditions. The successful resolution of the communication crisis felt like a turning point, proof that they had inherited not just their father's legacy, but the capability to extend that legacy through their own technical innovation and partnership. "We did it," Sid said simply, stating the obvious because the significance of their achievement needed to be acknowledged explicitly. Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of the challenge coin in his pocket along with a sense of completion that had been building throughout their deployment. They had faced the ultimate test of their professional partnership and succeeded through preparation, technical skill, and absolute trust in each other's competence. "Our fathers would be proud," Marcus replied, understanding that this observation represented more than filial sentiment. Roberto Rodriguez and Billy Thompson had established standards for communications specialists serving with Special Operations Forces. Their sons had not only met those standards, but had extended them through innovation that saved lives and maintained mission effectiveness under extreme conditions. The conversation was interrupted by Staff Sergeant Shun, who approached with a folder that contained official documentation of their successful crisis response. "Captain Morrison asked me to give you this," Chun said, handing Marcus a letter that bore the official seal of Special Operations Command. "It's a commendation for exceptional performance under combat conditions. Your work today will be used as a case study for other communications specialists deployed to similar missions." Marcus opened the letter and read the official language that documented their technical achievement and its impact on mission success. But the formal recognition felt less significant than the knowledge that they had successfully continued work that Roberto Rodriguez and Billy Thompson had begun 15 years earlier. "There's something else," Chun continued, producing a second envelope that looked personal rather than official. "This came through headquarters mail routing. It's addressed to both of you from someone in Tennessee." Sid opened the envelope to find a letter written in Eleanor Thompson's familiar handwriting, along with a photograph that neither Marcus nor Sid had seen before. The letter was brief, but deeply meaningful. "My dear boys, news of your exceptional service has reached us here at home through official channels and proud family members. Your fathers would be amazed and grateful to see how you have honored their memory through professional excellence and partnership that exemplifies the best traditions of military service." The enclosed photograph was taken the day before Roberto and Billy left for their final mission. They had just completed installation of a communication network that would support multiple bases across their area of operations. The satisfaction on their faces came not from personal achievement, but from knowing their work would help keep other soldiers safe and connected during dangerous missions. You have that same satisfaction now, earned through your own technical skill and dedication to the soldiers who depend on your competence. Roberto and Billy's friendship created a legacy of service that their sons have continued with honor and distinction. We are proud of you both and grateful that their story continues through your partnership and professional excellence. With love and admiration, Eleanor Thompson. The photograph showed Roberto Rodriguez and Billy Thompson standing next to a communication tower that looked remarkably similar to the equipment Marcus and Sid had been operating at Forward Operating Base Delta. Both men were smiling with the quiet satisfaction of professionals who understood the importance of their work and took pride in technical excellence. Looking at the photograph, Marcus realized that the circle that had begun 15 years ago in Afghanistan was not closing, but expanding. Roberto Rodriguez and Billy Thompson's partnership had created a legacy that extended beyond their own service to include their sons' military careers and the countless soldiers who would benefit from communication networks maintained through their technical innovation. "We're not replacing them," Marcus said, voicing a thought that had been developing throughout their deployment. "We're continuing their work with our own skills and our own understanding of what the mission requires." Sid nodded, understanding that this distinction freed them from the impossible burden of trying to replicate their Father-specific achievements while maintaining their obligation to uphold the same standards of professionalism and dedication. 2 weeks later, as their deployment neared its end, Marcus and Sid received orders for their next assignment. Instructor positions at Fort Gordon, where they would teach advanced communication techniques to the next generation of military communication specialists. Their innovation during the Sandstorm crisis had impressed Special Operations Command enough to request their expertise in developing training programs that incorporated lessons learned from extreme weather operations. The assignment represented professional recognition for their technical accomplishment, but it also provided an opportunity to pass on knowledge that combined their Father's experience with their own innovations. Future communication specialists would learn techniques that trace their lineage directly back to Roberto Rodriguez and Billy Thompson's work in Afghanistan, ensuring that their legacy would continue through multiple generations of military service. On their final night at Forward Operating Base Delta, Marcus and Sid performed one last communication check with the Forward Special Operations teams that had become their responsibility over the past 4 months. Each team reported successful completion of their current missions and safe status as they prepared for extraction and rotation back to home base. The routine communication check felt significant because it represented the culmination of everything they had worked to achieve during their deployment. Reliable communication had been maintained throughout their assignment, enabling Special Operations Forces to complete critical missions while remaining connected to their command structure and support network. As Marcus signed off from the final communication of their deployment, he felt the weight of accomplishment that came from work done with professional excellence and personal meaning. He and Sid had succeeded in following their father's example while creating their own approach to the challenges of military communication specialists. The torn patch that had initiated their partnership now seemed like a small beginning to something much larger, a continuing story of service, brotherhood, and technical excellence that would extend far beyond their own military careers. Roberto Rodriguez and Billy Thompson's legacy lived not in monuments or ceremonies, but in the reliable communication networks that kept soldiers safe and connected during dangerous missions around the world. Tomorrow they would begin the journey home, but they would return as brothers who had proven themselves capable of carrying forward the best traditions of military service while adding their own innovations and achievements to a legacy that honored both their father's memory and their own dedication to excellence. The Desert Stars that had witnessed their transformation from nervous young soldiers to confident professional partners now provided a backdrop for quiet satisfaction and anticipation of future challenges. They had completed their most important mission with distinction, but more importantly, they had demonstrated that some bonds, forged through shared loss, common purpose, and mutual respect, could transcend any obstacle, including death itself. The communication networks they left behind would continue operating long after their departure, maintained by other specialists, but built upon foundations that traced their origins to two friends who had served together in Afghanistan 15 years earlier. Roberto Rodriguez and Billy Thompson's partnership had created ripples that continued expanding, touching new lives and enabling new achievements through each generation of soldiers who inherited their commitment to technical excellence and brotherhood. Marcus Rodriguez and Sid Thompson had begun as strangers brought together by a torn patch during a routine training exercise. They were ending their deployment as brothers whose partnership had saved lives, maintained critical communications under impossible conditions, and continued a legacy of service that would inspire future generations of military communication specialists. The story that had begun with tragedy in Afghanistan 15 years earlier had not ended with heroic sacrifice. It had evolved into something larger and more enduring, a continuing tradition of excellence that honored the past while creating new possibilities for the future.